today's economic issues by bringing leading authorities to the University of Alberta and to Edmonton to discuss and share their professional insights about Canada's economic and business future with a global perspective. I can think of no better person for this role than today's distinguished speaker, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Paul Beaudry. Paul Beaudry became Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada in 2019. In this role, he oversees the bank's financial system activities and shared responsibility for setting monetary policy. Since 2021, he also oversees the bank analysis of international economic developments in support of monetary policy decisions, serving as the bank G7 and G20 deputy. Before coming to the bank, Mr. Beaudry spent 25 years as a professor at the University of British Columbia. He has also held academic positions at Oxford University, Boston University, Université of Montreal, and was also a visiting professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Panthéon-Sorbonne University, and Université de Toulouse. Mr. Beaudry held a Canada Research Chair in Economics from 2000 to 2015, and is a two-time recipient of the Bank of Canada Research Fellowship Award. Born in Montreal, Mr. Beaudry holds a BA in Economics from Laval University, an MA in Economics from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD in Economics from Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Paul Beaudry.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Felipe. Well, I'm really happy to be here. Merci à tous d'être venus. C'est un plaisir d'être à Edmonton. And I want to really take this first moment. I think there's some students in the room that need congratulations. I'm not sure if they're here. I'll kind of check. So we have a competition each year at the Bank of Canada, which is called the Governor's Award. And this year it was won by students from the University of Alberta. Are they here or not? And kind of their hands? Okay, congratulations. So it's always good in that competition. It's the idea of students coming up and telling us how they would run monetary policy, and that's always a good thing when times are difficult. It gives you new ideas, new perspectives, and we really appreciate it. It's excellent, the excellent work, and so they won. This is the national level, and they won. We find it one of the most pleasurable activities we do at the bank when we get that chance of having the students come in and say how they're doing and how they think monetary policy should be run. Now, obviously, my discussion today is going to be about monetary policy and just kind of putting things back in perspectives. We've had quite a series of years, kind of the last 3 years. If you look back, it's almost been exactly 3 years since kind of COVID started, and kind of very close, starting at least hitting really in Canada in that early March in 2020. And, you know, first line of defense was really health policy and fiscal policy, but the Bank of Canada tried to support the economy through that whole process by lowering interest rates and kind of supporting financial markets. Now, if you remember, that was a real, like, that early part in 2020, really the kind of economy kind of closed down. Actually, we had, you know, 2 million people that were put out of work. Unemployment went up to 13%. And maybe some of you remember, oil price actually even went to negative. That's just kind of saying how slow the world economy had become and how, you know, certain difficulties had arrived. Now, at the same time, the good thing is, after that real collapse, there was a real strong rebound too. So kind of going from there in that real at the bottom there of 2020, by the time we're kind of going into 2021, the economy was picking up. We went back to kind of 6% unemployment, and we actually managed to get employment in levels that was kind of even higher than that pre-pandemic aspect. So there's a real strong rebound there. But at the same time, there was really a storm brewing on the inflation front. So we really changed a lot of our patterns of consumption when we were during the pandemic. We started buying goods instead of services. And there's a certain amount of goods that can produce in the world, and everything was being demanded on goods, and all of a sudden the supply chain started having problems. The price of goods started kind of going up. We had the world was opening up again. Oil prices were going back up, and so we had that kind of inflation coming up. And then in 2022, on top of that, we had the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine by Russia, that even put more pressures on these supply chains, on oil prices. So inflation had been picking up. And since then, since the early part of 2022, the Bank of Canada, we've been raising interest rates to kind of slow down the economy, try to bring back that inflation level. And in part, we're starting to see some of that benefit. So if we kind of look relative to at the peak of last summer, we were kind of at 8% inflation. Now we've come down to around 6%. But that's very far from where we want to be at the bank. So we have to really stay committed in our aspect of fighting inflation and bringing it back down. Our target at the bank, and our mandated target, is 2% inflation target. And what I want to take today, even though we've turned the corner of that peak part, really want to kind of keep this focus on why we think it's so important to bring us back down to that 2%, why we're so committed to bring us back down to our target. So I'm going to spend part of my time kind of discussing three aspects. So I'll start by discussing some of the benefits, why we think getting to the 2% target is really useful. And that's the aspect of kind of the gains there. Some of the risk if we don't get there and we kind of let things deviate, some of the problems that can arise, and kind of understanding some of the trade-offs we see about that. So that'll be kind of the benefits and risks on terms of that front. And then I'll kind of turn and at the end kind of put that a bit in the international context. Not all countries will be doing things at the same speed. How does that matter for Canada? How should we think about that element? So those are going to be the 3 points I'm going to try to get in. So starting with the benefits here. Okay, so to start thinking about the benefits of coming back to our 2% inflation target, we have to think of some of the aspects of how inflation gets determined and what are the kind of forces behind it, and in particular how it's a whole dynamic system. It all interacts together, and then understanding how our 2% inflation target fits into that system there. So the first thing I want to just discuss a bit is kind of going to, let me just see, okay, I can go that direction. Oh, there, okay. So I'm going to be spending some time on this diagram. So I'll kind of have different versions of it, so we'll spend a bit of time here, and I'll try to point out the main aspects here. Now, I know the people online have trouble seeing my pointer, but people in the room should be able to see it. So obviously, inflation, what is inflation? This is people changing prices of kind of goods that we buy at a different speed. So we want to try to understand what are the forces that affect firms' pricing decisions. And the first order of magnitude of the things that affect pricing decisions is not very complicated, it's costs, okay? And those costs, so there's cost pressures that enter into the firm pricing decisions, and those cost pressures can come from two sources. They can come from a domestic source, and I'll talk in a bit in the international source in a moment. So let me start with the domestic source. There's different things domestically, but one of the big forces domestically that causes inflation is when there's a lot of demand relative to what we can offer in the economy. So that's what we call excess demand, and that puts pressure on prices, and those kind of get pushed into firm pricing decisions. These become costs. But what's important to see is it kind of moves in, but there's this feedback. So a lot of the things that we produce, in the economy, we kind of increase the price, and we pass them on to others, and they kind of have that price increasing. So you start getting this feedback aspect that goes from the part that it costs, it kind of moves into someone's price, and then it moves into someone else's price. And I'll kind of discuss that aspect of that feedback there. And it's really an important component of understanding how our 2% inflation target fits into this. On the flip side, it's not only domestic pressures, a lot of international cost pressures also play an important role. Especially in this period, a big part of that would be, internationally traded goods. Like, again, here we understand a lot the price of oil. It's not determined just in Alberta, it's determined in the world, and when that price goes up, it kind of goes into a lot of products. And again, here, those cost pressures enter into firms' pricing decisions, but those will feed back into some of those will be goods produced by others, creating, again, that kind of feedback loop. And what we saw during this the rebound from the pandemic is we had a lot of supply chains were having trouble, and those were kind of creating cost of these international goods, and that was creating these pressures and kind of creating that type of dynamics. So that's the part on the top part of that diagram. Now, that's not the only part that kind of matters when you're deciding. So obviously, the cost pressures are really central to determining prices, but other things that are important is actually what you expect inflation to be. So it's inflation expectation. So if you're a firm, you kind of have to think, okay, I have a certain cost. What can I think the market can absorb? Well, it depends what other firms are going to be pricing, what's happening in general in the economy in terms of prices, to figure out what kind of prices I can set at the same time. More I think that inflation is going to be high, more I think other people are going to be setting their prices high, and allows me to set prices high. And so one of the important components in terms of determining the price setting is also the expectations of people's inflation, or business owners' inflation expectations line in and affect that price process. Now, where do people take those expectations? Well, one part that kind of thinks, well, if I'm going to try to predict what's going to happen in the future, at least as a first pass, often we kind of think, well, maybe I'll just look at what just happened and kind of think, okay, well, if inflation's been going up at 6%, maybe I'll start thinking things will go up by 6%. And this is this feedback. That makes inflation expectations kind of being affected by inflation outcomes, comes in, and that re-enters in those inflation outcomes, affects expectations, and start feeding back. So we have two kind of feedback parts here that are kind of lying together. And that's the part of how prices are determined, and there's all this feedback and kind of creates a system that once you perturb it can kind of have all this dynamics and last for a while. Now, where does our inflation, kind of a 2% inflation target, kind of fit into this? Well, the whole idea of the inflation, our 2% inflation target, is to kind of reduce some of these feedbacks. Okay. Kind of seeing, let me try again. Right, not in the right place. Yeah, that's a bit, I don't know if there's, can someone do it by hand on there if I say to change? Okay. Okay, so what are the type of things that matter here in terms of how it feeds back? So when we're at a 2% inflation target, there's two parts to that kind of reduces these feedbacks. So kind of thinking when I was talking about the price pressures that are affecting the price setting behavior. So when costs go up, you kind of go on to kind of increase the prices. But if inflation is low, firms tend to not change their prices too often. And they know others aren't changing their prices too often. So that pass-through from cost to prices is actually slow. When we're kind of putting it down at 2%, firms tend to not change their prices too often. So a lot of that pass-through becomes very slow. So that feedback back into other prices slows down. So when you're at this 2%, you're getting everyone to kind of slow down the system and not pass things. So even if we have cost changes, it doesn't pass into other prices right away, therefore doesn't feed back, and that kind of helps stabilize the system. So we start getting that stability coming through that. We have the same thing here when we're working through inflation expectations. So what's important about the bank, when we have a credible inflation target that we're really committed and we kind of communicate and we do what's needed to get it back to that, that allows people to start thinking, okay, if I'm going to think in the future, should I just look at what just happened? No, you should start thinking, okay, if they're credible and they manage to kind of create, if the Bank of Canada manages to kind of support and bring us back to that inflation, you start using the inflation target as affecting your inflation expectation. That kills off another one of those kind of feedback loops. So as we move to a kind of low inflation target, a 2% inflation target, we're killing those inflation loops that are kind of increasing all this dynamics and creating a very unstable aspect of the price determination and reducing that volatility in prices. So both we get lower inflation and we get stable inflation. Now, when I'm saying all this, you could kind of ask, one more. This is, okay. Now, one more. Okay, low volatility. Next one, if someone has, okay. So I'm talking about this aspect of bringing, when we're at our 2% inflation target, not only do we get low inflation, we get low volatility inflation. And you might think, okay, well, that's a nice theoretical concept. Well, I'll kind of try to show you some of the data that kind of supports this. This is a very well-established aspect. So I'll show things kind of both over time for Canada, and here we have a graph that has some aspects for the US, but the right-hand side is actually the Canadian part. And what we see here is this is over time. So back here was the 60s. So the 60s had low inflation, and then the 70s went up, so in this inflation. So the blue line is inflation. Then we had the 70s and the early 80s. By the 90s, we came down. Inflation stayed there in 2000, 2010. And this is the pickup more recently. So this is our inflation level. This is the volatility or variance of inflation. When it's up, when the inflation goes up, this volatility of this inflation also goes up. When we're managing to get inflation down, the volatility all decreased, and now it's back up again. So also, when we have this high inflation, this low inflation level, we get lower volatility. Now, you can kind of ask, is this just a little bit off, these figures? Well, you can look at a whole set of countries here. So this is mainly OECD countries, looking over exactly 3 decades, different decades over time. And we're plotting here the average inflation level in a country, okay, on the x-axis, versus this variance or volatility of inflation. And what you see is in each of these decades, when the countries that are having higher inflation have higher volatile inflation. And why I push that is that there's a cost to having high inflation, but there's especially a high cost of having volatile inflation. When you have volatile inflation, that's harder to kind of predict things, to make decisions, make good business decisions. And the side of the Bank of Canada, when we manage to get the low at our inflation target and get that low volatility, what does it give us? It gives us extra freedom, degrees of freedom of how we kind of conduct monetary policy. We don't have to react to every shock in the economy all the time because they're not being passed through to prices. Things are nice and stable. That's creating that self-stabilizing system and allows us to have a monetary policy that's much more directed at keeping the economy close to that full employment level where we want to have everything working well. So by having it kind of come down, being at our 2% inflation target, not only do we get low inflation, we get less volatile inflation, we tend to get less volatile employment. So we get a whole set of benefits. That's the type of thing why we think it's so important to bring things back to that low, that our 2% target. Now, continuing on that, what are the problems of kind of moving away from that? So as we are right now, like I said, we're already in the right path. We've kind of gone from 8 down to 6, but at 6, we're still a long way from our 2, and we're really committed to kind of bring it back down to 2. What are some of the costs of not doing that? Well, obviously, part of that is just the opposite of what I was just putting, which is the mirror image. If we let things go, all those kind of feedback loops start playing again. Okay, so we get that part that, any kind of little price shock that arrives feeds into prices quickly, moves into other prices, and we get that feedback working its way through. And it's exactly that kind of creates that difficulty for businesses and households to plan well and kind of to adjust to the economy. Now, when I was talking about the part in terms of the expectation part, you might think, well, that seems a bit abstract of thinking whether people are going to rely on the target or not as a way of thinking about their inflation expectations. But let me give you some data, some suggestive data of how that kind of comes about. Okay? Oh, so sometimes it seems to jump. Oh. Let me go back one. Okay, so wait. Okay. Okay, this one. Okay. So what do I have on here? So this is an interesting, so the right-hand side is actually Google searches for inflation, okay? So this is the idea of saying, are people worried about inflation all the time? And so on the x-axis is the level of inflation in Canada, okay? So you kind of see when we're in the range, so for a long time over the last 30 years, we were in the range, which is the band for the target in Canada is centered about 2%, with a 1% band on each other side. So we try to keep inflation centered at 2 and kind of moving sometimes between 1 and 3. At those parts, people don't seem to search for inflation. They kind of think, okay, I don't need to know what exactly the inflation rate is. There's very low levels of kind of search. Google searches for the word inflation, trying to figure out what's happening. When we move above that 3 level, you see the link kind of going up. more and more Google searches. People are searching. They need to kind of know that inflation. That's what creates that feedback. Instead of thinking, okay, I can kind of rely on the idea that we're in an environment where there's 2%, I don't have to worry about all the little variations. You start kind of worrying about it and looking at it. So this kind of gets used in pricing decision, in wage setting decisions, and feeds back and creates that type of dynamics. So that was the left-hand side over there. If you look at the right-hand side, it's just the same image, but looking at in kind of newspapers and kind of the discussion of inflation. So in general, what we really see is when we're at that kind of situation of being close to our 2% target, people start not worrying about inflation. And that's really what we want at the Bank of Canada. Right now, you know, a lot of people are interested in what's the Bank of Canada doing and all that. That's not what we want happen. We want people not to talk about the Bank of Canada, just forget it and know inflation is being taken care of, it's 2%, and that's what we kind of want to be going there. Now, it doesn't only end there. There's actually even a deeper aspect of kind of when we can kind of bring back inflation down and being kind of low volatility, it's the information system. So one of the great things about a market economy is we have all these prices and it tells people different things and how to make choices and how to do things. But that depends very much on the environment that those prices are informative. So when inflation's kind of nice at 2% and kind of nice and stable and people aren't worrying about it, and let's say you go into a shop and all of a sudden see a price go up by a lot, let's say by 6 or 8% or 10%, you say, oh, wait a minute here, this is expensive, maybe I should go shop and kind of go buy somewhere else. Okay? And that process is important because it kind of creates the competition in our overall system. When we start having high inflation and volatile inflation, things start moving up and down altogether. Okay? Then the information, the price system becomes much less informative. We get the aspect that you all of a sudden see, oh, prices are up at 8%. Well, probably they're up at 8% of all the other firms. Why would I start searching? Well, if you stop searching, then the system becomes less competitive. There's higher markups that are possible, and the system becomes less efficient. So in that kind of longer run, by allowing the system to have higher inflation and higher volatility, we get less efficient outcomes. And to give an illustration of this is here, kind of using those kind of same data I had before, these OECD countries across different decades, and this is the link. So before we saw the link between level of inflation and the volatility inflation. Being lower inflation got you less volatile. Here it's on top of it. When we get that less volatile inflation, what do we get? We get lower unemployment on average. Okay? So often people think about, oh, lower inflation, that means higher unemployment. But over time, actually, lower inflation gives you lower volatility and gives you better labor market outcomes. Okay? And that's the type of thing that the system becomes more informative and kind of delivers better. So this aspect of our commitment, our desire to really get back to that 2% inflation target is really because of this whole set of aspects. It's really a better situation for Canadians. Some of it's in that we understand the transition can be difficult on people, but it's exactly this type of thing that we're kind of trying to get at. Now that kind of covers this notion of both some of the benefits of getting to our 2% inflation target and some of the costs of not getting there. So now I'm going to take a step a little bit different. So that's kind of the general situation. Now let me take a step back and put that in a more of an international context. Okay? Now why do I want to put it in the international context? Well, we're an open economy. We trade with a lot. We trade a lot with the US, different things. So you can kind of wonder, yeah, but can we go at it at the speed that's good for us in Canada? Or do we have to really worry what's happening in different other countries and at what speed they're coming back to their inflation target? Now, it might be like most countries has had very similar kind of increases in inflation. And now we might kind of come down at the same speed, but we might come down at different speeds. And why would we come down at different speeds? Well, it might be that the inflation problem underlying is a bit different across the countries. It might be the economies themselves are kind of more responsive or not to monetary policy to bring it back down. Or it might be that different countries are more committed to their inflation target. But for whatever reason, if we try to bring down our inflation faster, is that a problem for Canada? And what I want to suggest is it's not a problem for us. We'll see the kind of different things that can happen, but overall it kind of allows us to kind of come out at good outcomes. Now, in particular there, so what? There, okay. So this is kind of to get at this aspect of the different paths. Now, if I'm going to discuss about how it happens, so if we kind of have a path back to inflation target that's faster than our trading partners, thinking about, let's say, the US, if we have a path coming back, what kind of problems or kind of situations it can create? Well, that'll depend very much on the exchange rate. Okay? Now, right away, when I'm going to talk about a bit about the exchange rate, two things you have to know about the exchange rate. First of all, we at the Bank of Canada don't target the exchange rate. We let the exchange rate float. We target inflation. By letting it float, it allows us to concentrate on our mandate, which is to bring back inflation to 2%. But at the same time, we have to look at what are the implications as those things, what happens. The second thing I want to say about the exchange rate, predicting what it does is really difficult. So I'm going to kind of bring out some forces there, but anyone that's ever looked at kind of thinking about, predicting exchange rates, it's a very difficult variable to predict. I'll kind of come back to that. So if we have our inflation rate kind of comes down faster than another country, what's happening? Well, let's take the case where the exchange rate doesn't adjust. So if our inflation level comes down faster than the other one, that means our goods are actually, relative to the other ones, are actually becoming cheaper. Okay? So if there's not any adjustment of the exchange rate, we're actually becoming more competitive through that system. So that's one aspect, that if we had no adjustment. Or if it depreciates a bit, that would be the same thing. If we can get it back down faster than the others, we become more competitive, which has some of the benefits of kind of favoring more employment and different things in Canada. But that's not the only outcome that could happen. It could also be that we get appreciation through that process. And why would I kind of think about appreciation? Actually, many times when people talk about the aspect between these different paths and how it might work, they all talk a lot about interest rate differentials as being an important. In the short run, that's an important part. But what I want to kind of push you is kind of think a bit more in that kind of longer run. As we do this over time, why there might be pressures for an appreciation also of the Canadian dollar through that part. And here, the standard kind of more long-run kind of theory of exchange rate is this notion of purchasing power parity, that goods that are kind of similar tend to kind of come back to being a similar price over a longer run. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of data to kind of show you that. You'll see there's a lot of noise in this data. And what's fun about this data, and this is a series that's kind of built by The Economist, it's the Big Mac index. So maybe some of you have heard about this index. So this is just, you take the Big Mac and you can kind of think about how much a Big Mac costs here, and you can go to different countries and say, in Canadian dollars, if I was buying a Big Mac somewhere else, how much does it cost? And again, here, if our prices don't grow as fast as others, that would make our Big Mac basically less expensive than kind of in other countries. So let me just show you some data here, okay? Like I say, there's a lot of noise here, but here, this is where on this part, so this is where we'd say the Big Macs in Canada are cheap, and what you notice is when Big Macs in a country is cheap, there's a lot more points over here. This is the appreciation of the currency. There's a lot more appreciation than only a few that depreciates, okay? So what happens when your good kind of tends to be cheaper than abroad, you tend to get appreciation. But this is over several years in different aspects. So there in the background is, if we kind of manage this and get it lower, we might actually get appreciation. We might not. We'd kind of become more competitive, or we get some appreciation, and that gives us more purchasing power in the world of different things. So either way, this is actually kind of possibly good outcomes for us. Just coming back to the idea that we can pursue that goal of getting back to our 2% target at the speed that's good for us. We don't have to too much worry about how it's happening elsewhere and kind of bring it back down. So with all that, let me conclude here. Okay, so as I said from the beginning, it's been a hard time. We've had a lot of inflation. Inflation's been hard on a lot of people. Higher interest rates have been hard on a lot of people. Those are all things. We've had volatility. We've had difficult times. And that's what the Bank of Canada we're aiming to do, is kind of bring us back to an easier type of environment where things are better, stable, lower inflation, stable inflation, try to push, kind of show you some of the benefits, how it also creates that lower volatility of inflation, lower volatility of employment, better information in the price system. So it's all these gains. Not only that, we really think it's important that we communicate that that's why we're doing it. Why do I think the communication is so important? Is because more people understand what we're trying to do, more that process works better. So as I was talking about some of those feedbacks before, it's by telling people that we're really committed that some of those feedbacks by how past inflation leads into expected inflation kind of gets reduced. People start believing you. You're really committed, we'll get it back to 2%, and then the system will get back even quicker to 2%. Donc avec ça, je veux conclure. On a vraiment eu des temps difficiles dans les dernières années. On a eu de la volatilité élevée. On a vu que dans le passé, la stabilité amène la stabilité, la volatilité amène la volatilité. On veut ramener le système à un système plus stable, et c'est pour ça qu'on est commis à notre cible d'inflation de 2%. And with that, I'll just open up to questions.
Thank you, Deputy Governor Beaudry. Yeah, so we have time for questions.
Thanks very much for a very informative presentation, Deputy Governor. My question is, where did the 2% come from in the first place versus, say, 3 or 1.5, et cetera? And does it align with our global peers? Would the US and other similar countries have similar targets?
So it's a good question. So a lot of this, the 2% was kind of thought as exactly this kind of sweet spot of figuring out how far down you want to bring things. Okay, so there's a lot of the benefits I talked about kind of bringing it down, at the same time getting it completely down to zero. And so there was a lot of debate. So a lot of this was discussed in the early 90s and kind of getting at this part. And most countries, at least among advanced economies, kind of has coalesced around this kind of 2%. So we're not alone in that target of around 2%. And it's trying to balance that part that you really want to have it low because that really favors that stability. But if you get it too low, there's different things like what we've hit before. When we hit zero in terms of nominal rates, there's certain aspects that kind of create problems there. There's certain parts that we think a little bit of inflation in the background kind of creates a little bit of kind of oil in the machine, different parts. So there's a lot of studies, and we've, in the 90s to do that. And actually at the Bank of Canada, we kind of revise our framework every 5 years. And we've done a lot of work to try to re-question that. And so different times in our renewal process, that question has come up. Is this the right kind of number? And often that kind of comes up as a kind of getting that right balance. Now, in particular, what I think is really important here is you could think, wow, would it make a difference if it was 2.3% or kind of like a little bit different? And I think the main aspect here is really to remember what's important in a case like this is the credibility of your inflation target. So you can't keep on changing it. And especially in cases like now, when we've gone through a difficult part, you really want to say, no, we're committed to kind of bringing it back to where we were before this whole episode. You don't want to start changing it during the episode. Otherwise, the whole credibility of the system kind of breaks down. That whole part kind of cutting back some of those feedback loops disappears if each time, like, suppose if we kind of said, okay, well now let's open up and say 4% is okay because we can maybe make that easier. Well, then if we get another shock when we're at 4, then people say, well, maybe they'll kind of go to 6, and that's the issue. So there's both a good reason why that was chosen initially, we've re-looked at it, and there's a good reason to stick with it at this point in time.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. I am interested in how confident you are that the recent improvement in inflation is going to continue and not reverse. And at what point do we think we're going to get to the 2% from the 6% that we're at?
Okay. So right now, again, there's always a lot of things that can kind of change the system. So there's our overall path of where we think things are going, and we kind of look at all these different prices, the different pressures. Our best estimates of where we should be going on average is actually even by mid-year this year, we should be down by 3%. By the end of this year, kind of in that kind of 2.5, 2.7%, and going into kind of next year and kind of get really down to that 2%. Now, at the same time, could things kind of throw us off that? Yes, things can throw us off. You know, if the war in Ukraine gets worse and there's kind of even more kind of difficulties on the food side, or oil prices really jump up, yes, it can kind of vary all that. And so I don't want to overstate the certainty of that, but yes, we kind of see it as all these pieces kind of falling apart. Now, that's exactly what brought us in our last decision to take this conditional pause. So right now we've kind of said, okay, we think we've kind of raised rates a lot. We think inflation's going to come back down with what we've done, but it's uncertain. If things develop that way, we think we don't have to increase rates more to bring things down. But if some of these other things happen, we might have to increase again. And so that's a little bit where we've been giving that indication that that's the path we think is going to happen, but there's a lot of things that can happen in between, and we have to be humble. We've learned a lot of difficult lessons during this part, and so we have to recognize that it's not easy to predict inflation in a time when things are so volatile on the international front. Once you get the one there and one there. Yeah. Sure, there's a mic for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. So my question is, again, around the target here. Over the decade, kind of prior to COVID, 2010 to 2020, there was a lot, the business cycle was such that there was a lot of productivity improvement, globalization of supply chains, and a very deflationary environment overall, and probably easier to maintain that target. Is there discussion or scope around adjusting the target based on where we are in the business cycle? And obviously it's very different right now where globalization is and where a lot of geopolitical things are headed and where productivity might be headed in the future. Is there scope or discussion around adjusting this target based on the business cycle?
Well, I wouldn't. So first, there was several parts in your questions. Let me try to address different parts. I don't think you're really thinking along the business cycle. That would be like moving it all the time, as opposed to kind of reflecting some trends in the economy. So there might be, a reflection like, we're going through globalization, maybe we're going through deglobalization. That's not quite business cycle. Is that a little bit more kind of along the lines you're thinking? Yeah. So you'd want to think about that. Now, the first thing I'd say about that is that's coming up a lot, and that's a lot of discussion. And this, again, when I'm, as Felipe was kind of mentioning, I do a lot of these international meetings. So we discuss this type of issue at the same time. But what's intriguing about the inflation target regime is the idea that, okay, over this period, if you looked over before the pandemic, how close we were getting to 2%, okay? We were almost like, we've been averaging almost exactly 2%. Now, some trends have this downward part, some trends had upward parts, everything. When you have that inflation targeting regime, even despite all these different trends, you manage to get this 2% to average out. And so even when these trends are going to change, the likelihood that if you're very committed, this is a nominal type thing. You should be able to get that, and other parts of the system should adjust. And I think that's the way we want to think about it. And I come back, the last thing you want to do is change your target when you're in a difficult position, because that just kills your credibility. And so there's a real part of really wanting to stick to that at this point. But I think there's further reasons, even looking forward, to not overemphasize. I think what happens in the system is actually good at attacking trends. So kind of figuring out how trends are real things and kind of map back into kind of nominal aspects, that the system works. Where it's been difficult, and this is exactly when we're surprised. A trend is kind of something that people can predict and it kind of puts into prices, puts into everything. It's when we're surprised that we kind of made plans, we have, costs coming in, we have contracts on certain costs, we have labor contracts that are there, we have different things. Then everything's fit, and then all of a sudden the price kind of comes up. There's no way of adjusting it. So surprise things. So it's anything that kind of hits faster than the kind of length at which we have contracts in terms of our prices that we have to worry about in terms of inflation. Yes, I think we kind of get the mic.
Inflation ultimately comes from... Will you use the microphone, please, so our online attendees can hear? Inflation ultimately comes from a government spending money, more money than it has earned through taxation revenue. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of spending and less taxation revenue, and it's not too surprising that ultimately it filters through the economy and there's now inflation. And this has happened historically through the centuries. So I'm wondering, if the aim is to maintain 2%, is the government on board? Because otherwise, if it spends much more, inevitably it'll be hard ultimately to keep at the 2%.
Okay, let me take a step back there. So I think the more general part that the way I like to kind of frame the question is really what happens is when there's too much spending in the economy, and the government's one part of that spending, when there's too much spending relative to what we can supply, that creates inflation. And so there's part of that part that comes through that. So when, if the government kind of creates too much demand, we have, that kind of pressure on prices. Now, our role at the Bank of Canada is to take whatever, governments are doing and kind of figure out what we need to do in terms of interest rates to make demand in total in the economy readjust to that supply. And that's what we're trying to do at this point, is actually increase interest rates to the extent needed to kind of have demand equal supply and kind of get that thing back in balance and not having that extra pressure. The government is one element in that, but there's a lot of other things. There's how people are kind of spending. There's how businesses are spending. All those parts are part of it. And so I think you want to really take that as a more holistic part and really understand what has to be done in terms of interest rates to manage to get that back into line. And that's really the kind of main component of how to think about this aspect of what's creating inflation, is really that imbalance between kind of the demand and the supply in the overall system.
Thank you. I think I might get to do the last question. So the Bank of Canada has a single mandate in targeting only inflation, while other central banks often have a dual mandate targeting inflation and something like unemployment. How does that change how you implement monetary policy?
Okay, so the reason we actually think this is the right way of doing it, so again, in kind of our aspect is we kind of see it as the reason we like this single mandate is not because we don't care about employment, is we think that kind of gives rise to the best employment outcomes in the long run. And that's a bit like kind of some of the aspects I kind of presented in the talk, is by targeting inflation, you kind of create these situations such that the system can work the best possible and give us the best kind of outcomes in terms of employment. When you have both, it can kind of create that tension in the short run of not bringing out all those longer run benefits. And so that really is where there's potentially a difference there, that we can concentrate on kind of bringing to Canada what we think is the best outcome in terms of favoring a sustainable situation where people can go out, take their decisions, not worry about inflation. The price system becomes informative, the system works well, and we get the best employment outcomes out of that. So we don't have to directly kind of target the employment, we target it indirectly. Coming back to before when I was talking about this aggregate demand, aggregate supply, or the kind of capacity of the economy to supply things, that also takes into the labor market into account. We try to figure out, is there too much demand in the labor market now to be sustainable? And that's how we kind of adjust our policy rate to bring that back. And so that's the kind of the slight difference between a dual mandate and our kind of single mandate. But the fundamental aspect is we care a lot about that employment part. It's just that we think the accountability of it is much better to just arrive at as the inflation accountability.
Okay, so that concludes the question and answer period. Paul, thanks for making the trip to Ottawa to present this very interesting lecture.